All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today we are going to discuss a very important question, something that Christian and I have been debating, just kind of around the kitchen table, quite often, and that is, where exactly is the American Republic headed? And of course, if the word republic finds its way into any conversation, well, then a discussion about Rome is not far behind. And it turns out the Roman Republic, which existed for close to 500 years, had some of its own problems, some of its own crisis. And there was different points that there was different people that rose up during those various crises in order to deal with it. And we're kind of wondering, if we draw those parallels with the Roman Republic, where is the United States Republic currently at? Are we at the sort of point in our own history where we need a Cincinnatus, a Sulla, or are we going to get a Caesar? And that is what we are going to discuss today on Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, who was mad at me earlier for no reason, Queen of the Bees. Oh, yeah. I'm just all of our dirty laundry out.
My goodness.
Yeah, she got all mad at me because I don't stay on topic. For instance.
Okay, so actually, this is a hostage situation. While the boys talk about Rome, I've got to sit here and kind of try to keep time.
She's monitoring your questions.
And I'm going to monitor questions, but definitely this has the potential of being a 3-hour hostage situation.
and our primary hostage taker, the Oracle of Virginia, our resident historian and political prognosticator, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
I'm super excited for this episode. We're gonna try to make it 3 hours, right?
We should have brought snacks and energy drinks, but you want me to timekeeper over
I could run downstairs and go get some. I'm here all day for this topic.
Yeah. That would be a good time. All right. Well, so that is that's kind of the source of the topic here is, I think all of us recognize that there are certain things going on within the American Republic. I think most of us want to save the American Republic. We'll see if everybody at the table does, or if other people have some sort of, I don't know, different idea of what the current American public should morph into and become. That will all be discussed, but I will tell you this much. If you are going to save America, you're not going to do it with a lack of protein, that's for sure. And that's where Good Ranchers comes in. Because if you want to talk about a company that is worth saving right along with our glorious American Republic, it is Good Ranchers, because they produce the best American raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood you will find anywhere. I know, because I checked every other single one on the planet, and Good Ranchers was the best. In fact, we eat Good Ranchers on a almost daily basis at this point.
I put a couple of those bone-in ribeyes on my big green egg that I got for Christmas. Oh my goodness, they were so good.
Yeah. If you want great American raised, again, beef, pork, poultry without hidden additives, antibiotics, or hormones, you're going to go to goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick. Not only are you going to get, again, the best meat ever, you're going to get $40 off plus free bacon, ground beef, or seed oil-free chicken nuggets or salmon in every order for a year. It is actually a happy day at the Freitas household when our Good Ranchers shows up. It's an even happier day when we get free stuff along with the order. So if you want to experience that same sort of elation that you get from the best American raised beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood, goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, $40 off. And you get to choose. You get to choose one of those free things with your order. Go check that out today. All righty.
I love meat replenishment day. It's so great.
Yeah, it is. It is good to have that, to go to the meat freezer and put that on there. Yeah. So, all right. So we've mentioned these three names a couple of times. We're going to go through each one to give everyone kind of a perspective on what we're talking about here. We got Cincinnatus, Sulla, and Caesar. Christian, give us your quick overview of each one of these important characters within the history of the Roman Republic.
So Cincinnatus was a figure in Rome's early history. He's arguably a mythical figure, but the story basically goes that Cincinnatus is, and I'm summarizing, of course, right?
Yeah.
But he's a farmer who gets called up to deal with a crisis, and so the Romans make him dictator, and back then that term means something different than
it was not a negative connotation.
Yeah, it was not a negative connotation. It simply meant somebody that has broad, vast powers to solve a crisis. So he's made dictator. He solves the crisis, and then he goes back home to be a farmer. He doesn't make himself king. He doesn't make himself emperor. He doesn't stay on as a dictator, or he does not become what the ancients would call a tyrant.
Yeah.
Instead, and they did draw a distinction between dictatorship and tyranny. And then he goes back home, and then lo and behold, a few years later, the exact same thing happens, and he gets called back up for a second time, and he goes through the same process again, and he saves the Roman Republic, and then he goes back home again. And Cincinnatus he's upheld by the Romans and by the Americans, by the way, by many different cultures, as kind of the embodiment of virtue. He's somebody who steps forth to solve a crisis. The people rally behind him and around him, and he does what needs to be done, but then he voluntarily lays down power and he goes back home. And so George Washington is upheld actually as the American Cincinnatus. That was a nickname that was given to him when he was alive. There's a reason that we have a city in Ohio called Cincinnati.
Yep.
We honored Cincinnatus in our own country because we viewed him as almost like the perfect embodiment of Republican virtue.
I want to say that the Revolutionary War officers after the Revolutionary War, the members of the Continental Army and whatnot, actually had a society called I think it was the Society of Cincinnatus. Yeah.
So Washington is upheld as the American Cincinnatus. He's somebody that he's given vast powers. The Continental Congress makes him basically the commander-in-chief of our armies during the Revolutionary War. He helps fight and win that war. We end up making him our first president after we go through the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And then he serves 2 terms, and he's basically elected effectively unanimously, right? And he's even given an option to get a 3rd term, and he instead goes back home. And not only is he given an option for a 3rd term, twice, he's kind of given the option to make himself a king.
Yeah.
And he turns it down 2 times in a row. So you could argue that there's 3 instances early in America's history where he's given the option to either have power or retain power or seize power, and he denies it all 3 times. And, he's really upheld as the father of our country in many respects, not just because he's our first president, but because out of everybody in American history, he is kind of given the most chances to make himself a dictator or a king, and he doesn't take it, and instead he goes home.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's why he's kind of a hero of anybody that you would call kind of like in the traditional Republican sense, that idea of the leader that assumes the power necessary in order to restore society, but then immediately gives it up. So that's why he is kind of cherished as the ideal, and he was cherished by the Romans as kind of like a kind of like a perfect manifestation of the spirit of the Republic. Then much later, we get to Sulla. So, all right, explain the whole idea of Sulla here.
Okay, so Sulla is not nearly as revered as Cincinnatus.
Yeah.
I won't go like super into detail with his background unless you want us to talk about that. We did talk about that when we went through our episode on the Roman Republic that we recorded over a year ago. Highly recommend that you go listen to that. It's probably one of Nick and I's favorite podcasts that we've ever done. But Sulla was a general during arguably the crisis of the Roman Republic, early on in the crisis. So he comes after the Gracchi, who we might actually bring up in this podcast. And he does not relinquish power. He takes power. I believe he marches on Rome, twice, doesn't he? He ends up taking power in a civil war, and he becomes dictator. And what he does is he spends most of his dictatorship trying to, quote unquote, fix the Roman Republic. So he institutes all sorts of reforms. He purges his enemies. He consolidates power. Now, to his credit, he does eventually step down, but he is not a Cincinnatus type figure. He, in some ways, thinks that there's things wrong with the system. And so rather than dealing with a crisis, he's actually kind of dealing with internal mechanisms within the Republic structure itself. And he's trying to fix those things while being a dictator to do so. And then only after he has fixed things, he steps down and relinquishes power.
And again, to kind of be fair here, I mean, there was like a major...
That's not to say there weren't things that needed
there
to
were
be
a
fixed.
lot of things that were very, very problematic. I mean, to give you an idea, some of the key aspects of Sulla's reforms, right? Like Sulla's reforms were primarily designed to reestablish the Senate's supremacy in the Roman state, which had been weakened in previous decades. So they wanted to, again, Sulla significantly curtailed the power of the tribunes of the plebs, who had traditionally served as advocates for the plebeians and could initiate legislation. He required tribunes to submit their legislation proposals to the Senate for approval and prevented them from holding further elected office after serving as a tribune. Another thing that he did that he's really known for is formalizing the cursus honorum. So Sulla formalized the political career path, also known as the cursus honorum. I always mispronounce that, which outlined the sequence of public offices a person could hold. He established requirements for holding specific offices, such as requiring a quaestorship before a praetorship and a praetorship before a consulship. Legal reform, Sulla established new courts for specific offenses, clarified the distinctions between civil and criminal law, and restricted the ability to adjudicate in lawsuits to senior senators. There was a lot of things that he did where if you actually looked at what was going on, if you looked at some of the things that had taken place and problems between the plebs and the patricians, there were issues, and there were issues with the way that the Roman Republic had been operating with the power of the tribunes. The question is could you actually break with the tradition of Rome, which was again to march your legions right in and purge your enemies could you actually get away with doing that and then stepping down and saying, okay, now that I've fixed everything, we're going back to, this new republic that I have created with these new processes in place, even if some of those reforms were good and needed, right? So that's the difference with Sulla. And that leads us to Caesar.
By the way, last thing I'll bring up on Sulla is that from Sulla's perspective, he succeeded because he did step down. He disbanded his own legions after he stepped down. He stepped down at the beginning of his second consulate or consulship. And so I'm sure that Sulla was thinking that I am Cincinnatus reincarnate, basically.
Well, he even, one of the things that he did that was interesting upon leaving was he enacted a new treason law designed to prevent insurrections by provincial governors and army commanders. So essentially, he established new treason laws to prevent what he did. At least that was the goal. That was the goal. Yeah.
So that's who Sulla is. And now we get to Caesar.
Yeah.
So Caesar comes not quite immediately after Sulla, but pretty quickly after Sulla.
Mm-hmm.
And Caesar is the man who doesn't really try to reform the system, even with a blunt instrument, the way that Sulla did. He intentionally breaks the system because he views the system as kind of tyrannical. And the irony being that he does it with a significant but not universal amount of public support. Caesar stages a civil war. He famously crosses the Rubicon, declares the die is cast, and he marches on Rome with his 13th Legion. And he wins. He defeats Pompey, his former friend and ally, who tragically is killed by the Egyptians when he flees there.
Yeah.
But
well, let's do, again, not to give Caesar too much credit here, but part of the reason why Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legion is because he knew he was about to be tried by the Senate for treason because of everything that he did in Gaul and Britannia. And, Caesar arguably...
There was also a lot of politics going on.
Oh, yeah, no. So you had a triumvirate with Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. And Caesar was considered kind of the junior member. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. Pompey was probably the most revered man in Rome at that particular time. He was a very popular general, Pompey the Great. Crassus goes and gets himself killed fighting him and his son killed fighting the Parthians because he was a little bit, again, he was the richest guy, but he was also kind of a jerk. Nobody really liked him. Pompey had been an incredibly, famous and successful general. And so you started to see this shift taking place, and now the Senate sided with Pompey, and a lot of the plebs or what you might call Caesar was more of a populist movement, and again there was these long-term kind of problems between the plebs and the patricians, between kind of the upper class and the lower class of Roman society, but part of what Caesar had arguably done, which had violated his station, is when he became governor. And he kind of you could argue that he was defending a Roman ally from, was it the Macromani tribe? I can't remember what it was, but it was like a Germanic tribe that was attacking a Roman ally. And basically this took Caesar on kind of his conquest of Gaul. This week at the Gallic Wars. He actually even crossed over into Britain at one point. And he had a lot of enemies within the Senate that essentially wanted his head. Now, while he was serving in this position, he couldn't be tried. But the moment he stepped down, well, now he could and would have been tried. And what he was trying to negotiate with Pompey was this idea that, all right, look, we're both going to give up our legions. We're both going to kind of, come back together and try to resolve this on equal terms. But obviously Pompey, the Senate, didn't want to do that. And so there was a lot of things going on. Nobody was really innocent in this process between Pompey and Caesar, or the Senate and Caesar. But that was one of the big reasons that led to Caesar actually crossing the Rubicon, and that's kind of worked into the popular lexicon, is making a decision that you can't go back from.
It's also worth noting that Caesar, in many respects, was also very generous to his defeated enemies. He kept granting them amnesty. He kept trying to say, let's negotiate throughout the Civil War. When he won, he did not do nearly, I would argue, he did not do nearly the degree of purges that Sulla did.
Yeah.
And you could also argue this ultimately cost him his life,
yeah.
if you think about it. But, I mean, Caesar, in many respects, kills the Roman Republic, though.
Yes.
So he's a gray figure, because you can look at things from a certain perspective, certainly from his perspective, and you can say a lot of what he does is justified. But you can also look at the consequences of what he does, and you can be like, he is the man, more than arguably anybody else, that kills the Roman Republic that had lasted for centuries up until that point.
Yeah.
It's the crisis of the Republic, which kind of went, kind of got its roots all the way back during the era of the Gracchi brothers, reaches, in many respects, its crescendo with Caesar. You could also argue it reaches its crescendo with his nephew, who ends up succeeding him, who's Octavian, who becomes Augustus, who we also might eventually bring up on this podcast.
Well, we should mention too. I mean, Augustus obviously, like he keeps the appearance of the Principate. He's not the dictator. He's not the emperor. He's the the
first citizen.
The first citizen, right? Mm-hmm. But he's running the show, and the Senate largely takes on more of a figurehead role and a rubber stamp. They're not completely powerless, but I mean,
it is the end of the Republic.
Augustus is the one calling the shots.
There's
right?
a reason we call him the first emperor.
Yeah, and we call that the beginning of the Principate, and that's the what we think of as imperial Rome. But we also need to mention the Gracchi brothers, because you've brought this up before. Like, this is kind of a lot of stuff that happened with the Gracchi brothers was kind of a precursor of watching an element within society essentially rebel against kind of the status quo, and being the first to kind of really start to break the system.
Yeah, I mean, the Gracchi brothers are like the first populists, if you think about it. Mm-hmm. They're not literally the first populists, but like, they're populist leaders that are pointing to things like needed land reform, the negative consequences of Rome's victory over Carthage and many of its other rivals in the Mediterranean. So like, by the time they come to power, Rome has kind of defeated its enemies externally. Yeah. And now it's like that friend-enemy dynamic has become internalized to Roman politics, which had never been the case in the centuries going back to the overthrow of the monarchy. Rome had kind of been cohesive, with some exceptions.
Well, they had always had an enemy. It was the Etruscans, or it was the Samnites, or it was
the Macedonians.
The Macedonians. It was the Carthaginians, right? They had always had a significant threat close to their border, which kind of galvanized Roman attention, and
there was a strong cohesive Roman identity and culture. Yeah. There was the all sorts of things like the Mos Maiorum and stuff like that. Yeah. There were a set of civic principles that almost had a religious connotation to them, where it was like, no, it is not about you as an individual, it's about you as a Roman. You are part of a larger whole. You have certain duties and obligations to the Roman state. And that's not from a tyrannical Stalinist perspective, right?
It was a very constructive form of patriotism.
Yes.
That like to give you an idea, I forget who the Roman general was, but it was during one of the Punic Wars, and when they were consuls, they got 1 year. I got 1 year as consul, and they had to do as much as they possibly can as consul. And I can't remember this guy's name now. I wish Regalius, I think, or whatever. Roman general goes down there. It is beating the Carthaginians pretty good, and then loses, gets captured, and gets sent back to Rome under the condition he has to swear an oath by the gods to go back to Rome and to convince the Roman Senate to not continue the war against Carthage, and then he has to come back. So I think it's Regulus. Regulus goes back to Rome, convinces the Roman Senate to continue to fight Carthage, and then goes back to dutifully goes back to Carthage and gets tortured to death. So, and he was held up again as another prominent a prominent example of the Republican spirit of the Roman Empire, that he would fulfill his duty to the Republic and fulfill his duty to the gods, even if it meant him voluntarily going back and getting tortured to death by the Carthaginians. So, like, to give you an idea, like, this is the sort of like patriotic feeling that people had about Rome, the greatness of Rome, the system of Rome. And again, I would say that in a lot of ways, I always grew up kind of feeling this idea about, the American Constitution and the Republic and the sense of patriotism, and ask not what you can do for your country, or ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? That kind of, there is such a thing as a healthy patriotism, and there was something about the Roman Republic that instilled this in a lot of their leaders. Not to say that they were perfect, but that's a pretty extreme example of somebody willing to stand by what they believed was their duty and their honor to the Republic.
And by the time you get to the Gracchi, those principles are starting to fray, and you have huge mass inequality. You have large numbers of veterans that went and fought and conquered the land that made the empire. And I say small e empire in this case because it's still a republic, right? But they went out there and they did the conquering and fighting, and then they would come back. Many of them are wounded, and they're unemployed. They're being thrown off their farms. They can't compete with the vast numbers of imported slave labor from all the conquered peoples that are able to outcompete their local farms. So you see a lot of them congregating in the cities, and you have a large growth in numbers of like urban poor. And so you're getting like class divides, you're getting sectarian divides, you're getting ideological divides. And the Gracchi are coming along and they're saying it's not fair, it's not just for Romans to put themselves at danger for the greater good, for the sake of the nation, for the sake of the state. And then they come back and they find themselves being dispossessed within their own country. And the people that didn't do the fighting, that are sitting in the forum debating in the Senate, they're the ones buying up all the land. They're the ones importing all the slaves. They're reaping the benefits. And the ones that are actually doing the fighting are being thrown out onto the streets. And so they pushed for things like land reform, saying that, there needs to be a limitation on the amount of land that a single individual or family can own. Well, that didn't really go over well with the aristocracy. That didn't go over well with the patricians. And so the Gracchi respond with very not copacetic legal responses, right? They kind of let's put it like this: they don't always violate the letter of the law, but they certainly violate the spirit of the law on multiple instances. And the final result is the Gracchi basically get murdered. And that is in many respects the beginning of the end, because blood had not been spilled in internal Roman politics in something like, I don't know, 200 years or something like that by the time that the Gracchi are actually murdered. It's actually more than that. I think it's like 300 or 400 years of nonviolent political adjudication of power within the Roman state, going back to the revolution that overthrows the monarchy. And the Gracchi are killed for the first time in centuries. Blood flows not from warfare, right? Not fighting Hannibal, but because of internal political disputes.
And let's be fair too. It's not as if the Gracchi were just a thorn in the side of the patrician class, and so they killed them. The Gracchi were actively using the mob in order to threaten, beat up, and punish their political enemies as well. So the Gracchi were also using populist violence in order to achieve their objectives. Now,
but they would argue the populist violence though was justified because they were being stonewalled.
The part that they would argue that I think made some sense was the idea that the system itself had become so basically intransigent that the people that controlled the system, the people that controlled the political power, could essentially prevent any sort of substantive reform from taking place. And so the idea is that, well, the only way we're going to break this cycle is if we actually break the current system. And so they were willing to use. Now, again, you could look at the conditions that were taking place within the Republic at that point and say, hey, they had some really good points. Does that justify the use of the political violence that they were utilizing, and then how it came back on them? And again, it is an interesting discussion, but it's another one of these cases where it's really, really hard to find a clear-cut good guy, bad guy in these scenarios.
Yeah. That's going to be a rerecurring theme throughout this podcast. So like those are all the figures that I think we're going to go through from Roman history.
Yeah.
And
So
look,
now,
there's things you can draw from each of them, but the question is,
well, I think so. Let's look at real quick. Let's do just kind of this really quick parallel.
okay.
So you got this various periods of the Roman Republic where there are legitimate grievances. There's significant differences of opinion with respect to how you're going to address those grievances. You have almost. I think there's some bigger cultural differences taking place in the United States than were taking place at Rome at that particular point. But if you wanted some sort of parallel, you could probably bring up the fact that you had the Republic had grown significantly in a relatively short period of time. And so that had some questions with respect to the power of the Senate, the power of the tribunes. You also had,
It had vanquished its enemies abroad.
it had vanquished its enemies abroad. There was nobody that was really challenging Rome at this period from like an existential standpoint, because by the time you get up to, not so much with Cincinnatus, but definitely by the time you get up to Sulla and Caesar, there is, they've taken out Carthage, they've taken out Macedonia, the Greek city-states. Egypt's not a threat. Ptolemaic Egypt's not a threat. The Gauls are not a threat anymore. There really is no external threat. The Iberians are not a threat.
The Seleucids are defeated.
So like this is it. It's like now it's a question of who's gonna wield the power internal to the system. And you do have a multicultural system throughout Rome in the sense that it is a legitimate empire, right? There's multiple different cultures, multiple different civilizations which have been incorporated, but there's also no question that at least on the Italian peninsula, Rome is the dominant. There's a dominant culture.
Yeah.
Nobody's.
We're not in the 5th century yet.
No. Nobody's walking through downtown Rome right now going, "What about the rights of the Syrians?" Right? Like that's not a thing. But again,
they don't have BLM protests, Burgundian lives.
No, Burgundian lives matter. but you do have a sense that there's almost a 2-tier system, and that system is held in place to be able to protect the people closest to power at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah.
And the people that used to believe that there was some sort of through the tribunes or whatnot, used to believe that there was some sort of process whereby their concerns and their issues could be adjudicated. They would have certain champions at times, right? Are now no longer believing that. And you have certain people within the patrician classes, or you have certain people within the kind of established class that are claiming to argue on their behalf. Some people may be more genuine than others. Some people are using them for their own political purposes. Some people are, seriously trying to address their concerns. And there's also kind of a breakdown in the faith of the traditional institutions, which have been held up as a kind of a glue for the Republic.
And also arguably the civic religion of Rome. The Mos Maiorum starts to disintegrate in that same time period. So you have institutional rot. You have growing internal political fractures.
Yeah.
You have civic rot as well. And eventually you get what they call the crisis of the Roman Republic, which is kind of this century-long period where it's just everything starts to unravel and you just have civil war after civil war. And eventually you start getting these strongmen dictators coming in until finally it ends with Augustus putting a permanent end to it and ushering in what we call the empire.
Yeah.
Now, the reason we're bringing this up is because we can draw a lot of parallels.
Yeah, it's
not 100%,
perfect,
but there are a lot of parallels between what has happened to the Roman Republic and what is currently happening to the United States. And so the purpose of this podcast is we laid out all the different paths, so to speak, all the different figures.
If we can acknowledge that within the United States right now, and here's what I'll say is we kind of mentioned the Roman conditions. Here's what I think are the U.S. conditions right now. We have a huge problem with respect to our monetary policy. and being just a fiat currency as well as the world's reserve currency. There are issues with trade. We can disagree on what the best way to deal with it, but there's definitely issues with trade, and a lot of that is tied to the monetary policy. There is no question that there are major divisions within the country on the direction it should go, whether or not our history is something to be proud of, to be ashamed of. I would argue that we are increasingly going into two different. We're largely finding ourselves in two different groups. One group that you would say is generally feels positive about the American founding, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Another that is definitely more wants to see a much larger role for centralized government, that is far more convinced at Marx's explanation of the world than, say, Jefferson's or Madison's or Adams. You also have a case where there is a very, very strong centralized government. And one of the things that we've recognized is that a lot of money is being confiscated from people in order to push a particular ideology. And we would probably argue to protect one ideology at the expense of the other. And so there's this almost this feeling of hopelessness that our institutions are either against half of us, or at the very least not providing us a mechanism where we can adjudicate differences, right? So those are some of the things that I look at within the American system right now, some of the problems that we are struggling with. We can debate orders of degree, orders of magnitude, but I don't think you would get a lot of people that would, wholeheartedly disagree with what I've just said, as if, well, no, that none of that's true.
Yes.
And I think one of the other major things that we've kind of also addressed is, I don't know if you would say the first time in my lifetime where you have a significant movement within the country that fundamentally does not like the United States, does not think we're a force for good in world history, does not think we're a force for good in the world, and wants to alter us to such a degree to where it would bear very little resemblance to what we were. I think that's a fact at this point. Again, we can argue to what degree or what order of magnitude, but when I listen to the left talk about what they want for our country, it doesn't bear any resemblance to what I feel is what I grew up in.
Yeah.
And it's gotten to the point where it's like, okay, well, what is the mechanism for peacefully adjudicating between these two things? Well, the problem is that these two things are not compatible. These two things do not two things do not coexist with one another, because one system says we're going to use government power to impose this, and the other system says, or the system that we've traditionally gone with says, well, no, neither of us are going to use political power in order to impose our will on the other. And the question now is, okay, do we save the old order, or is something new about to be ushered in? Based off of a loss of conviction that you actually can have a society where government plays a very, very limited role and doesn't attempt to, push its will on one side or the other. And that's where we get into this conversation. So the first one that we're going to discuss is
the best case, arguably.
The best case is a Cincinnatus possible. And a Cincinnatus situation is, okay, we acknowledge that there's a crisis. The question is what makes Cincinnatus unique is that he operated within the mechanisms within the system. He operated within the mechanisms within the system in order to save the system. Now, the threat is that what happens if you give him dictatorial power and he doesn't give it back? That's the concern. But he did. So he comes up, he fixes it, and he goes back to his farm. And so that was kind of like the ideal condition, is he didn't try to drastically alter anything. He didn't try to fundamentally change the system itself. He didn't try to fundamentally alter the republic. He legitimately took up the power that was granted to him to save the existing structure of the republic, and then gave it all back.
You can also argue that everything he did was legal, because
Yes.
the Romans legally gave him dictatorship. And again, I'm using this in the classical term, right? The Romans legally gave him dictatorship. He legally wielded the powers that had been granted to him, which were almost absolute, because it was basically a state of emergency. The Romans had kind of a built-in constitutional mechanism to grant somebody dictatorship to deal with a problem. And that's exactly what he did. And then he stepped down and he followed the process the whole entire time, which is kind of why I think that it's impossible for us to get a Cincinnatus
Well,
today.
the question is do we have? So let's look at another quick.
Nick was looking at, I got to bring this up. Nick was looking at the outline that I constructed because I built the outline for this podcast.
Yeah.
And he was like, all right, right before we started recording, he was like, all right, I'm reading through the outline. And he was like kind of laughing to himself because of the arguments that I was putting forward.
Let's draw a parallel, because again, I have always been fundamentally a defender of the American system, right? And our constitutional system now is envisioned by our founders. We are very, very far, obviously not including slavery. I think slavery is bad. All right. Thank you. I've done my caveat, right? But the constitutional system the founders put in place, I actually thought was a very, very good one. I've always defended it. But the one thing that our constitutional system never provided for was any sort of what we might call massive concentration of power in the form of an executive in order to adjudicate like a crisis issue.
We do not have a declaration of emergency clause that allows for dictatorial powers to be. We do have something about suspending things like habeas corpus in there.
Yeah.
There are mechanisms arguably for emergency powers that are incorporated in the Constitution, but not to the degree that the Romans had within their civic system. And they had an unwritten constitution, but it was still obeyed until the very end.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's arguably one of the big problems, but I mean, I've got a few of them in here. If you don't mind me just going through them and getting your response here. So here's the outline that I constructed for Cincinnatus. There's 3 things that I think are required for Cincinnatus. First one is a figure who has real power and chooses not to use it, or should I say not to abuse it?
Yeah.
Because he does use it, but he certainly doesn't abuse it. Second is that we need a unified culture that's still, in the words of John Adams, moral and religious. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is you need a functioning elite that's capable of self-restraint and willing to rally behind him, because Cincinnatus didn't act alone. He had the Romans were behind him the whole way. There wasn't sabatage, right?
Well, you can't say all the Romans, right? But like
the overwhelming majority of them supported what he did, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't mass attempts at sabotage. There wasn't internal fighting. It was, no, we have this crisis. We've picked our leader to rally behind. We're giving him the tools to fix the crisis, and we're going to support him in that process.
Yes.
Here's why I don't think it can happen.
Yeah.
So forget for a second of asking, does a Cincinnatus even exist? I think that alone is worth asking the question. Do we even have a Cincinnatus in our society today? But let's set that aside for a second. Suppose that there is a Cincinnatus out there. A Cincinnatus that is moral and virtuous and religious and meets all of the personal requirements to actually wield the type of power and authority that's necessary to do what needs to be done. Let's just assume for a second that there is somebody out there. If there is, I haven't met the guy yet. Maybe it's you. The list kind of begins and ends with the guy sitting in front of me.
Give me all the power.
I would don't. He's skipping to the end. He's skipping to the end. I'd be fine with that. But I mean, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But assume for a second that there is a Cincinnatus. How do you get him into power? Nobody has yet told me how you get a Cincinnatus into a position of authority where he can actually do what needs to be done.
We don't have the mechanism.
We don't have the mechanism.
No.
Do you make him president? Do you elect him? And then what? We're doing that right now with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the president. You have so many Republicans out there that kind of, it's like they're trying to make Trump a Cincinnatus for all of his own, personal failings and everything. I'm not saying Trump is a perfect person, but there's plenty of Republicans that are like, we need dire reform. This is why we elected you. This is why we support things like Doge. There's all sorts of big changes that Trump is trying to do. You had, Project 47, Agenda 47, you had Project 2025. There's all these big things that conservatives have been talking about, and we put Trump into office to do them. And look at what's happening. The people aren't rallying behind him. We are, but half the country thinks he's a dictator.
Well, okay, but I'm going to push back a little bit there. To the extent that you want to trust, the polling or whatnot, he's actually been polling pretty well with all of this going on.
Sure.
One of the things that I think we lose sight of at some point is we haven't even made it to the first 100 days. I mean, that's nuts. Like, I can't tell you the last time.
I still can't believe it's even happened sometimes.
No, well, it's with Trump elected, like, it seems like every president that gets elected, you fly through the first 100 days because, you have a lot of media attention around the inauguration and the things that go on kind of right off the bat. But like the actual scope of things that have been done in the first 100 days thus far, because we're not there yet, is pretty significant. I would say it's pretty historic. So again, I don't want everybody on the ledge yet, right? But I get what you're saying, that it's not as if, again, we do not have a mechanism to actually even choose a Cincinnatus in order to wield a certain amount of, there is no mechanism within our constitutional system to provide for that, period, the end.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the key issues that I have with the idea that, well, we just need a Cincinnatus to fix the problem is, A, where are you finding one?
Mm-hmm.
B, how do you get him into a position of power? So there's a procedural issue with it. How do you even get a Cincinnatus into a position to do what needs to be done? But there's also a cultural issue. Rome, when Cincinnatus was around, was culturally homogenous. It was unified. And I don't just mean that in the sense that they all spoke Latin.
Yeah.
I meant it in the sense that they all believed in the same certain, fundamental, axiomatic set of principles. There was a shared metaphysics within Rome. There was a shared unified culture set of values. It was kind of embodied by the Mos Maiorum.
Yeah.
And so it was easy. Not only did they have a functional mechanism, a procedural mechanism to put a Cincinnatus in power, there was also a unified set of principles, beliefs, metaphysics, culture that allowed for the Roman people to rally behind that Cincinnatus and support him in what he was doing. There weren't people going out there, at least large numbers of people going out there on the street saying Cincinnatus is a dictator. Well, he was a dictator, but again, there wasn't people saying he's a tyrant.
Yeah.
There are people on the streets today that are saying Donald Trump is a tyrant. We are a totally fractured culture. There is no shared value system. There's no shared metaphysics. There's no shared philosophy. There's no shared worldview. There's no shared morality. All of those things were in place when Rome had a Cincinnatus. And by the way, all of those things were in place when America had Washington. And so my issue isn't even just procedural. I think that alone is a huge hurdle to overcome. But
I look, I'm agreeing.
The bigger problem is more than just process and procedure.
Well, yeah, you're right. You have to have a legal mechanism, and a culture which actually supports it. And you could argue that in the story of Cincinnatus, both of those things existed. That it wasn't just a legal mechanism that actually had a provision for this sort of thing to take place. And that legal mechanism is actually important because it's a reflection of the culture. The culture arranged itself in such a way to where it said, this is our political system, this is our legal system. If X happens, Y is the response. And the reason why that's so important from both a legal and a cultural perspective is because you now have a legal mechanism in order to carry out what the culture has already considered as a potential problem. And again, we need to understand that our legal system does not provide for such a mechanism. Now, I think we could have an interesting conversation on why that is. I think part of what our founders wanted was they didn't want to provide a mechanism where somebody could assume that kind of power and then not give it back, because as they look throughout history, that's the more common. We don't have a lot of, the reason why Cincinnatus is held up as this iconic figure is because there ain't a lot of them. Right. And even Washington is not a perfect one-for-one representation, because it's not like he was given legal authority to become king.
No, but he was given the opportunity.
But he practically had an opportunity, but I wouldn't even say that it was the same situation of Cincinnatus where it could be something like, okay, there's still a distinction there is the point I'm trying to make. What our founders actually wanted was at the very least, was a federal government so small that it wouldn't have the capacity of wielding such power. And so why do we have a dictator mechanism if the federal government can impose itself anyways?
Yeah.
And so I think whereas the Romans said we need a dictator system in the event of a crisis, I think what the founders said was, no, what we need is federalism in order to prevent that sort of centralized crisis from taking place in the first place. So it's not that I don't think the founders accounted for something like that. I think they try to set something up in the system to where it wouldn't be necessary.
Yes.
Okay. So, all right. So what's your verdict on, so what is your overall verdict? Is the Cincinnatus even possible?
No, zero chance of it happening. In fact, actually, I wrote down here in our outline, I said, Christian's verdict, absolutely zero chance of happening. The moral capital that made Cincinnatus possible is long gone. The American ruling class no longer produces men like that, and the public no longer expects them. It's a bit of a black pill, but I would argue it's realistic.
So here's the only pushback I'll give, and maybe we should have done Cincinnatus last, but the only pushback I'll give on that one is whenever we say America doesn't do X anymore, I completely agree that a certain portion of America doesn't do that anymore. I can certainly agree that a lot of our culturally shaping institutions are at the end of the long march to the institutions, and heads up, we didn't win. But the thing that still gives me hope that underlying spirit still exists within the United States is not only something where, hey, Trump wins, overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, wins significantly in the popular vote, does Doge. Polls generally seem to be overall supportive of a lot of the work that they're doing. But it's also this idea that when I look at new media, when I look at things within the culture, I do see a shift taking place against woke. And it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening in other places. The question is it too little too late? And again, that's its own show, it's its own podcast. But I don't think it's fair to say I'm not black pilled. Because I do see this massive resurgence when we do an episode saying that 70% of, or young men are polling more conservative than they've ever polled before. That suggests to me that no, there's hope there. It's not guaranteed that simply because they're rejecting woke, they're going to adopt what, we believe, but there is a clear rejection taking place within younger generations against the current status quo. And so I still get hope from that. Now, I will concede that we have no legal mechanism for a Cincinnatus. I will concede that as much as I think the founders did the best they could to try to prevent the need for a Cincinnatus ever taking place, there is currently a need to push back against this system. When a lower federal district court judge can essentially stop the entire process and force you to bring, people that are in the country illegally and violent gang members back into the country, I think all of us are looking at that going, careful how rigid you make this system, because at some point you're going to encourage people to break it. Again, if the elections don't have consequences, well, then that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. It'll just mean that more and more people will start to believe that elections don't matter at all. And so, again, I think we're in a delicate place. I don't want to say that I agree that we cannot have a Cincinnatus in the sense that Rome had a Cincinnatus. I'm not quite there yet in believing that the only way that, we can correct the system is by completely upending the constitutional system that we currently have. But
so this might be where Nick and I mildly disagree that we'll get to in the.
Well, let's go on the Sulla. I think is an interesting one, because I think that, to your point about Cincinnatus is not legally possible, and it's hard to imagine a process whereby you can achieve a Cincinnatus type result without a legal mechanism for Cincinnatus. Sulla, on the other hand, is something that we could theoretically end up with. The question is to what degree? And so we've had the conversations before about, Trump and Sulla, and this idea of, so far, despite what all the left is screaming about, and look, I'm at a point right now where when the left makes an argument, it's hard for me to even listen anymore, because I never believe that they're good faith arguments. The same, the Constitution is 1 minute, this sacred document that we can't believe Donald Trump is stepping all over because he sends an illegal El Salvadorian gang member back to El Salvador. But then, 2 minutes later when they're in charge, it's an old archaic document written by white slaveholders. Like, which is it? Do you hate the thing, or is it a sacred text that we have to abide by? Because I know what I believe about it, and I've been amazingly consistent. You, on the other hand, hold it up as something to adhere when it suits you, and just as easily dismiss it when you don't, which means I don't listen to any of your arguments anymore.
But here's the thing. They are consistent. They're consistent in pursuit of power.
Yes.
And so when they say,
but you know what I mean? They're not consistent with respect to.
But they're consistent in what they care about, which is pushing leftism, entrenching leftism as the ideology of the ruling class and as the dominant, almost state religion of the country. And so if the goal is push leftism, cement leftism, and the way to get there is cite the Constitution 1 minute and then decry it as a document written by evil white slaveholders from 200 years ago the next minute, they will totally do so and not bat an eye for a second.
When they say this isn't a good, or when they make that argument, right? When I see Chuck Schumer make an argument about Donald Trump stepping all over the Constitution, like, I don't even listen anymore. Because it's like, well, I know what you're after, Chuck, and it isn't adherence to the Constitution. So your appeal to the Constitution means nothing to me anymore because I have acknowledged that this is not a good faith argument.
And this is precisely why the circumstances for a Sulla are greater than the circumstances, much greater than the circumstances for a Cincinnatus, because you need a not total, but you need at least a substantial breakdown in that shared moral discourse and the shared power of legal norms for a Sulla to emerge in the first place.
So let me ask you this question. Think about this for a second, because I would say that with Cincinnatus, you kind of have one side of the spectrum. With Caesar, you have another side of the spectrum. With Sulla, you actually have a spectrum within the Sulla, right? Because Sulla obviously went to extreme measures, right? He walks in with his legions, he purges his enemies, he rewrites laws. And you could argue that none of that worked within the system within the Roman Republic. But you could say that his intention, and this was manifested by many of his actions, not all of them, was to restore the Republic or to create a new Republic, which was more fair and equitable and all those other things, right?
And more resilient.
There is, so here's kind of the gray area within the American system, right? And this is the separation of powers. And it's this idea of competing powers. And so some of the questions within the American system are not as clear cut. So, for instance, when the federal judiciary, when a congressionally constituted federal district judge, of which there is, I think, 460, when one of these federal district judges says you have to return those illegal immigrants back to the United States. Now, you could argue that a Cincinnatus move would be for Trump to comply with that injunction, right? But then fight it and win it legally at the Supreme Court or whatnot. That would be maybe a Cincinnatus move. A Sulla move might be to say, I don't see anywhere in the Constitution where you actually have the authority to issue an injunction, a nationwide injunction that would actually stop this. I know you've done it in the past, but I don't acknowledge that that's an actually constitutionally protected authority. So I've deported them in accordance with my authorities as the President of the United States, and I'm not bringing them back. I could argue that is kind of a Sulla light. It's not marching the 82nd Airborne Division in Washington, D.C. and purging your enemies, right? But you could argue that, that's a constitutional crisis. Was it really a crisis, or is it a question that needs to be answered either legislatively or legally? But is there some sort of benefit to Trump pushing the issue on that question?
Well, I mean, I certainly think there's a benefit to pushing the issue on that question, because those type of things need to be pushed. That's kind of the heart of the problem.
So here's where it becomes very Sulla-esque, right? Trump right now has said, well, I already shipped people home, but I'm listening. He's still listening to the courts, and he is. Let's say a district judge says that, Trump says no, and then the Supreme Court rules in favor of the district judge. See, that's the point where I think you've got a little bit more.
Democrats are currently trying to argue that the Supreme Court just ruled on this case that you brought up. They're trying to say the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against Trump. Stephen Miller talked about this the other day in front of the White House. That is not what happened at all. They actually overturned the lower court ruling and said you were interfering in foreign policy.
Yeah.
And you need to be careful about doing that.
Yeah.
And then they turned their attention to Trump and basically said facilitate fixing this issue
with due process of law.
With due process and stuff like that. But they did not say that you must re-import.
Yeah. Well, again, this is why when the left makes an argument about the Constitution, I almost glaze over.
I've gotten to that point too.
I just don't know many of them. That's not to say I don't know any, but at this point I know so few people on the left that argue on behalf of the Constitution in a consistent way that it means nothing to me when they do it. I know I'm just being manipulated. But the larger point that I'm getting to here is on that spectrum of Sulla, the Sulla spectrum, right? Hardcore as I'm marching troops in to save the Republic. The lighter side is I'm going to continue to push these issues to get a court ruling. And honestly, I would argue at this point, Trump could say, I've worked totally within the system. I disagreed with a lower court ruling. And the way that we typically adjudicate these is for the Supreme Court to make a decision. The Supreme Court overruled your decision. but then also said, I need to be careful about due process of law. I think that for me, that's the sort of pushing I want from this administration. I want them to push back on some of these decisions that have been made by these, activist judges. The thing where I think it gets a little bit harder is what happens if the Supreme Court had come back and ruled 5-4 that no, you have to bring back all of these, El Salvadorian gang members.
This is why there's a bit of, and by the way, I would not be surprised if something like that were to happen, because we know the liberals on the court would just, you can never count on them to do the right thing ever. Well,
and again, to your point, it's because they honestly believe that engaging in judicial activism is what they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. They're a judge, so they're supposed to decide in their own minds what is just and then manipulate the law in order to fit it.
So ultimately the reason, here's what you need for a Sulla. I've got 3 points in this case as well.
Yeah.
You need a general or an outsider who seizes power in order to clean house, basically. Mm-hmm. You need massive popular discontent and a breakdown in institutional legitimacy that allows for that vacuum to be created that he then fills. And then you also need a belief that emergency measures aren't like they're basically the only way to fix the problem.
Yeah.
And Sulla filled that void. Like, people talk about, like, well, Sulla laid the groundwork for the death of the Roman Republic. No, the emergence of Sulla is a symptom of a problem.
Yeah.
It's actually, in many respects, it's not that Sulla drives the dagger into the body of the Republic and then Caesar twists the knife and then Augustus pulls the knife out and kicks the body into the grave.
Yeah.
That's usually the sequence of events that historians talk about. No, it's that Sulla's very emergence was actually signs that there was a crisis. It's not that he created the crisis.
Yeah.
And you could also argue that it's not the Gracchi who came before him that created the crisis. Mm-hmm. It's actually that the emergence of these figures was symptomatic of the crisis, not the driving force of the crisis itself.
Well, and you can argue that with all revolutions or attempted revolutions, is that they are usually trying to address something that is a legitimate concern. The question is whether or not they properly diagnose the problem and then gone about arriving at a solution that actually makes sense or gains sufficient popular support. So when I look at the 3 points that you've said, this whole idea that a general or outsider seizes control to clean house, I think, obviously Trump got popularly elected. I don't think you necessarily, obviously, again, Sulla hardcore is, you just seize power. Like, I'm in charge now and this is what we're doing. But I think you can also have a Sulla type response by electing someone like Javier Milei. Javier Milei is operating within the system in Argentina because the system in Argentina actually grants significant power to the executive branch when it comes to managing the executive branch. And so, again, I wouldn't say he's operating like a Sulla, but he's also not operating like a Cincinnatus because he didn't get in there to just, return things to normalcy, right? There wasn't some, populist revolt that he was putting down. He is trying to fundamentally change the way the Argentine government does business. When you go from 22 federal departments to 9 by executive order, that is definitely a significant departure from the last, arguably, 7 to 8 decades of our Argentine government tradition. I do think people elected Trump to do something significant. I think that's reflective in, we'll say, the ambitions and hopes for Doge. It remains to be seen whether or not it can be done. I think when you get into massive popular discontent and breakdown of institutional legitimacy, I think that has largely manifested itself with, say, 40% of the population. Well, I take that back. If you look at conservatives, there's a ton of conservatives that feel as if, the government's broken, Hollywood's broken, the educational system is broken. If you look at the left, a lot of them feel the same way, but they want to go even harder to the left, right? They're using the current system as it is in order to try to usher in a very, very different system. So I do believe that there is technically massive popular discontent and breakdown of institutional legitimacy. We just disagree very significantly on what that breakdown constitutes and what the solution to it should be. And then a belief that emergency measures are justified. This is the part where I don't think it's gotten bad enough for Americans yet. I just don't. I think we're still as frustrated as people are. we still live at a time and place in history where we are still relatively prosperous, relatively safe and secure. A lot of the things that people are angry about, they're angry about like externally. And then a lot of other people, the younger people who are more angry in a sense of wanting to like actually rebel or revolt against that system, they are, I think a lot of them are finding themselves in a situation where it's not so much, let's go grab our torches and pitchforks as much as it is, who cares? Right? I can find plenty of other things I can do to, get the necessary dopamine hits. Nothing's going to change anyways. So what's the point?
I would say this, there was a poll, this was done in the UK, so I don't have numbers for the US, but I'm willing to bet that they're similar. There was a poll recently that came out in the UK that showed 52% of British Zoomers said, quote, "The UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with parliament and elections."
Who said this?
52% of Zoomers in the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where, and again, this is the part where you look at it, it's like, yeah,
That's Sulla.
This is the environment that's Sulla.
Or Caesar.
Yeah. That's,
or Augustus.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely a Sulla or Caesar mindset. No, it isn't. Like no, it isn't. They feel like there's
and
something
it's certainly not like
wrong.
Cato or Cicero.
And they're tired of hearing that the next election cycle will fix it if we put the conservatives back in power in the UK, because they don't believe that. And why would they? The conservatives have run the place for 14 years and made it worse.
And when the conservatives go out, I mean, this is the problem the Tories have right now, is that they're going out there and they're talking about, well, we just need to fix the system and make all these reform, and they don't understand that. No, people, I'm speaking with the UK right now, but the youth in the UK are not saying we need to reform the system. The youth are saying the system is fundamentally broken, and any politician that is talking about operating within the bounds of the system does not understand what time it is.
Yeah.
And so they're not interested in the Tories. They're looking for reform. And increasingly, they're looking at reform and they're saying, you're not going far enough.
Yeah.
I want you to talk about how you're going to put the Royal Navy in the channel and stop the boats from coming across.
Yeah.
I want you to talk about how you're going to fire and prosecute judges that perpetuate a two-tiered policing system where you could be a member of a Pakistani rape gang and get almost scot-free for doing so. But if you wave an English flag in front of a building and you're protesting mass migration, we're going to treat you like a domestic terrorist within your own country.
Mean tweets, I can expect police on my door within 24 hours.
No, it's not about fixing the system. Yeah. The system needs to be overthrown, and that's why you're getting so much resentment where they feel like democracy doesn't work. They're losing faith in the liberal democratic system because they're seeing that it doesn't matter how you vote. You're always getting Tony Blair, no matter who you vote for or how you vote or what you vote for.
Yeah.
Well, if it doesn't, if there's no real choice and it's just always Tony Blair neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And people don't want that, then eventually they're going to be like, give me Charles.
Yeah.
Dissolve Parliament, right?
Yeah.
Like rule and that's not going to happen. And so what they're going to instead look for is give me Cromwell.
Yeah.
Right. And that's when you get a Sulla type situation. Now, the argument against a Sulla emerging is, I think, a couplefold. One is you could argue that we haven't quite gotten there. For example, at least in Sulla's unique case, he came to power not because he was voted in, but because he marched on Rome with an army. At least in the United States, but also in the UK and in many Western European countries, the military has not been fully consumed by ideological culture wars. It's still relatively apolitical. It's still relatively neutral as things can actually be. You don't have a situation where you have these independent generals that have the type of power and influence to take charge themselves.
Well, can we
the way
say
that Sulla did?
Can we do one other, let's mention one other person right now, that's Marius. Because as one of the big things that happened was, it used to be in the Roman Republic, the way that you serving in the military was actually considered part of your civic duty. And the people that actually bore the brunt of that were the landowners. It was the wealthy people. It was the equites. And that started to change as the Republic went on, and they got, again, the upper classes got, fat and happy. And, but then all of a sudden you have this displaced population that got kicked off their farms or just, couldn't compete or couldn't find work. And one of the Marian reforms was to change what the army had been in the Republic which was not necessarily this large lumbering standing, military that
It's
was
like
there
a
all the time.
citizen militia.
It was more of a citizen, not exactly, but very,
Yeah.
very much more like that, much more of a civic responsibility. And he changed it into more of a professional system where now people that before had not served in the military, like it was primarily the people that could afford their own equipment that actually served in the military of the Republic, with some notable exceptions at times of crisis and things like that. But Marian was the one that really, the reforms that kind of expanded and exploded the size of the legions. And if you think about it, there's a lot of people look at like, oh, this was again the beginning of the end of the Republic. But you can understand where Marius was coming from. Like, okay, we've got all of these men who are unemployed, and that's a dangerous place for a lot of young men to be. We're going to allow them to actually serve within the legions. And obviously now if I have a bunch of legions, what am I going to do with them? Right. This ends up, and then not only that, but we were still at a time where generals in the Roman Republic were a large time responsible for, it's not like at all points in Roman history, their pay was coming from the Senate. A large part of the pay of legionnaires came from plunder. If you had a successful general that, won a lot of battles and was putting you in positions where you could gain plunder and you could gain prestige, you had more loyalty to your individual general than you did the Republic or to the Senate. You can even say, yes, I love the Republic, but my general is a better manifestation of the honor of the Republic than that filthy bunch of fat guys sitting in the Senate that are you getting fat and rich off of my sacrifice. Right. So
that's exactly what happened.
So you could follow this logical line of thinking. This is the reason why, again, the early Republican army was set up very differently than after the Marian reforms. But it created this sort of conditions where when Sulla tells his legions, you're being mistreated and it's all because of corrupt politicians in Rome, we're going to go fix it. Their attitude was, cool, like, let's go do it. And they could do that, feeling every bit a sense of they were going there to save the Republic. And so we don't have that sort of arrangement within the American military. There is no, the 82nd Airborne Division isn't dependent upon, plunder in order to receive their pay.
And they don't have more loyalty to their commanding officer than they do to the Constitution or to the country as a whole. At least not yet. We have not. We are definitely not in that.
We're not even organized. There is no general that is raising up a division to go fight a war. Right? That's not a thing. The closest you could ever argue that we came to stuff like that was actually a little bit closer to the militia system, like Teddy Roosevelt and whatnot. When you look at the Rough Riders, those were examples of, so it's more like 19th century military culture was a little bit more prone to the idea of a prominent citizen within a particular area would actually help finance a regiment.
Yeah.
But that's not something that's existed in the United States for a long time.
An issue that would result in Sulla coming to power is the military is not independent enough. It's not strong enough, and there's not charismatic generals like Sulla. So the only other mechanism is through the electoral process. But another point that I have brought up for why it might not happen is that I write that the regime's just too stable on paper.
Yeah.
We just simply haven't gotten to a point yet. There's problems, right? We have institutional collapse. You have lack of legitimacy. You have a fractured public, a fractured culture. But we haven't fully gotten to the point where you have the power vacuum has grown so much that a Sulla figure almost just kind of inevitably falls into it to fill that void. We haven't quite gotten there.
Well, and let's face it, the people that, so a lot of the people that are the most frustrated with the way that the system is operating, other than the left that we already know wants to, break it and turn it into something else. But on the right, to violate the Constitution is to be a traitor.
Yes.
And so anybody that would presume those sorts of power, it's one of the unique dynamics about the American Republican experience and tradition and culture is that preserving that system is a part of what makes you a patriot. And so to try to break it for the purpose of preserving it is something of an oxymoron within our system in a way that I don't think existed in the late Republic.
There's a question if you guys would like to answer. Whitfield says, Could penal legions be a fix for illegal immigrants and criminals?
No, we do not want a federati system at all.
So to give you an idea, one of the things that the founders were always worried about, along with being a standing army, is they were really worried about mercenary armies. And if you read Machiavelli's The Prince, he talks a lot about how mercenary elements within it, like any sort of republic that gets to the point where they're more reliant on a mercenary army instead of a citizen army, is in trouble, because sooner or later the mercenaries say, why aren't we running the show? And you've seen that as a common problem. The other issue that you have is what Christian just said, which was the federati. And that was especially toward, what would you call it? There was at one point, Rome did a pretty good job of incorporating people from other reaches of the empire into the legions and creating more of a Roman culture. But what they started to do later on, especially with the Goths, was they incorporated entire Goth units and we're not talking about, hey, that's a cavalry auxiliary. I'm not talking about Gallic cavalry that is part of a Roman legion. We're now talking like a significant portion of the Roman army was a Gothic contingent. And they started to become more and more reliant on groups that did not share a Roman identity being responsible for protecting Roman borders. And there was times where that worked, like the Catalonian fields, where the Romans finally turned back the Huns and did so largely with a Gothic king that fought alongside the Romans. But on the whole, it ended up being a mechanism where your fighting was done by people that had no loyalty ultimately to the Republic, and that's a real problem.
Yes, I agree. So
there was another question asking if the U.S. is headed for another civil war.
Well, I think is that in the part 3 here that we're about to get into?
Yeah, we might actually get to that. So
yeah, so let's
Sulla.
Let's wrap up Sulla and then we'll.
I don't know about you, but my verdict is that it's possible that you get a Sulla, but it's not. It's not imminent.
Yeah.
There are too many things that still need to happen. Or if they do happen, it wouldn't be a Sulla, it'd be a different type of. It'd be like a Gracchi. And the other problem too is that, Sulla's biggest mistake in many respects was he stepped down from a system that he had reformed, but was too weak to function without him. And so that kind of leads actually directly into part 3. But before I do that, I'm curious what your take is. Like, I think it's possible that we get a Sulla type figure. I know that there's some people that would say Donald Trump is a Sulla type figure, but I don't think Trump has gone like full Sulla. He has not done prescriptions. He has not done, treason trials and stuff like that. He is not rewriting parts of the Constitution to make the system function better.
Yeah.
He is much more still operating within the bounds of legality.
The question is, should he?
But we're going to get to that.
Could he?
But like, Sulla is this gray zone where I theoretically I could see a Sulla figure emerging, but I think it's actually more likely that you get a Gracchi or some of these other figures that we're about to get to than a Sulla. So I'll leave it on that before we move on. But I'm curious what you think.
I don't think as much as the left wants to scream and cry about it, there's no scenario where Donald Trump is marching, again, the 82nd Airborne Division into DC and imprisoning, half of Congress, right? Like that's not a thing. That's not going to happen. The area where I could see something is more on what I might refer to as the Sulla light. Sulla hardcore is what Sulla did, right? The Sulla light would be to say, I am going to challenge certain things, especially within the judiciary, with respect to what we can do with the federal government. And again, the left would cry that was a constitutional crisis, especially if he started ignoring orders from the Supreme Court. But that kind of depends on, what sort of orders the Supreme Court comes down with. The other thing, but honestly, even if let's say he started to do with the federal government what Javier Milei is doing with the Argentine government, that would clearly be a constitutional crisis. We would have to answer some really serious questions on what we were willing to accept with respect to the power of the chief executive. But that's one area that I could see him potentially getting away with stuff that would focus that question, which would pull it more into the realm from Cincinnatus into Sulla.
And there have been times in our nation's history where leaders have done things that are completely unconstitutional and it stood. Like the first one that pops into my mind is the Louisiana Purchase situation.
I would argue that was constitutional because it was a treaty that the Senate ratified.
Well, but here's the deal. He signed it before the treaty had ratified it. Like Thomas Jefferson even admitted that he did not follow the strict constitutional process. The reason why everybody let it go is because the Senate agreed to it after the fact. But technically, he did not get Senate approval before doing it.
If you use that model, is kind of what Trump's doing now.
Well, he hasn't even gone that far.
Well, he's testing the ground.
Yeah.
He's testing sort of whether or not the court really is going to have this type of power or not, and whether or not the House and the Senate are going to vote to codify some of this.
Let me, and this is going to be our segue into the next part. Let me tell you what I think frustrates so many people. For all the screaming and gnashing of teeth that the left has been doing, like petulant little brats, Trump has not done anything that you consider to be Sulla-like. Everything he has done so far has been within the legal system. And I don't think that's a bad thing, but I think what we should also recognize is the amount of pushback we're getting from certain Supreme Court justices, the amount of pushback we're getting from certain members of Congress. It's like he's able to operate this far within the system. Why? Well, because we have the presidency, we have the House, we have the Senate, and we have overall one of the more favorable Supreme Courts that we've had in the last 100 years. And yet, we still can't seem to get our act together when it comes to getting prepared for fiscal year 2026 and the continuing resolution. We still can't seem to find more than $150 billion worth of money that we're willing to cut because, well, we want to cut fraud, waste, and abuse, but we don't want to cut actual federal spending when it comes to dismantling some of these departments that shouldn't exist. Right? We like even with a president that seems eager to do it, a vice president that seems eager to do it, you know, a Congress which has the power to do it, a Supreme Court which at least should be somewhat open to it. Even then, we can't seem to get anything more than, well, we'll get 150 billion worth of cuts and you know, fraudulent or wasteful spending in the next CR.
And it seems like they keep kicking this can down the road because of the filibuster. The filibuster is kind of the thing, which makes me think there is going to be a point where we end up getting rid of the filibuster.
Probably not with the current majority leader in the Senate, but the point I would say, I don't think Thune does that, but here's what I will say. I think the problem is that if significant reforms are not able to be made during this administration under these conditions, a lot of people are going to come to the conclusion that it's never going to happen. I don't see us getting through 4 years of Trump without any significant reduction in the size of the federal bureaucracy, without any sort of prosecutions of people that deliberately violated their oath of office. I think that's where we get into part 3 here, and that's the whole Caesar scenario, where what happens when enough people have just come to the left doesn't ultimately want to save this process. The only reason they're interested in saving it to the extent that they are is because they know that they've done a good job marching through the institutions. They know that ultimately the mid-level bureaucracy works for them. And so to the extent that they want to save that, sure. But you're honestly telling me you know a bunch of leftists that genuinely want to preserve the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? You're honestly telling me that? Because I don't buy it.
No, they want to preserve the process and procedure that legitimizes the institutions that they've come to dominate.
They've come to dominate. And so this is the part we're getting into part 3 of, okay, what's the Caesar probability? Now, again, let's first define what that actually means.
Yeah, so Caesar is the popular. You remember that poll that I brought up?
Yeah,
Caesar is that strongman.
Yeah,
that apparently the Zoomers in the UK are waiting for. He's the man that comes in and seizes power, wields it unapologetically, and keeps it. And he doesn't. You know, Caesar never declared himself king. Right? Mm-hmm. That was his nephew that eventually set up the empire. And he didn't even declare himself king either, right? He was just the princeps. But historians kind of mark that as that's the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. Caesar is a Sulla who doesn't step down.
Mm-hmm.
And he's a Sulla who doesn't, well, let's tweak that. Let's tweak this. Now, Sulla does more than just tweaking, right? He does prescriptions and stuff like that. But Caesar he doesn't try to reform the system. He is like, no, the system is broken.
Yeah.
I'm coming in order to fix the broken aspects, right? I'm not reforming something. I am permanently changing things.
Yeah.
Sulla made some permanent changes too. He made constitutional reforms, but Caesar's a bit different because he doesn't step down.
Yeah.
Right? He's eventually murdered by his political enemies who he was arguably too generous to.
Yeah.
After he had defeated many of them in the civil war that brought him to power. But like Sulla, Caesar takes power militarily. He fights a civil war. He marches his legions on Rome. He takes the city. He defeats his enemies. He grants a lot of them amnesty. I said this earlier.
Brutus had fought against Caesar, lost, been captured, and he immediately welcomed Brutus back into the fold.
And he's given a spot in the Senate where he eventually kills him.
Yeah.
I mean, he's brought back. He doesn't have like substantial political power, but Caesar tries to reconcile. That's actually where he doesn't go full tyrant, right? Caesar is not a Stalin in the sense that he just kills everybody that stands in his way and sets up this military dictatorship where he just shoot, not that they have guns, right? But he doesn't like shoot all his enemies and stuff like that. But he takes power, he holds it, he wields it, he cements it in his own hands. But he is certainly generous to his friends, but he's also generous to his vanquished foes to the point that he brings them back into the Senate, even if he strips a lot of the power away from the Senate.
There's different historical perspectives on this, but whether or not he just used it as justification for something he wanted to do anyways, possible, or whether he was truly, furious about it. But when the Ptolemaic king killed Pompey, Caesar did not respond with, "Thanks a lot, bud." He responded with exhuming, or giving Pompey a proper burial and then putting Cleopatra on the throne in Egypt. And in part because Caesar was fairly adamant, and I think this is, somewhat political, but it was also, remember that Pompey was married to his daughter. So they were family at once. Like Caesar, even though he was younger than Pompey, was Pompey's father-in-law. And so there was history there. These people had fought together on the same side of a lot of different battles. And there was this idea, and this plays out in a lot of areas with respect to how Caesar conducted the civil war of what was it, the Third Triumvirate. He was all about reconciliation because he did recognize that he believed that there was some benefit to basically burying the hatchet and then moving on, because Caesar also did believe in the glory of Rome. He thought that the Roman Republic had become very, very corrupt, and the Senate had become very, very corrupt. And he did one of the things that Sulla did is he flooded the Senate with new senators from lands that he had conquered and controlled in Gaul in order to try to tip things in his favor. So he was still trying to prop up some semblance of the Republic and the Senate for traditional reasons and for I think psychological purposes. But to your point, he had there was no exit strategy for Caesar. He wanted to be running the show.
And so the points that I have for what would be required for a Caesar figure to emerge is basically a total collapse in trust in institutions. Mm-hmm. You would need a charismatic figure that rises up and basically promises to break the system on behalf of the people, because Caesar is a populist. He comes from the popularis faction. And you need a public that is totally fine with that, actually. You need a public that's like, I don't care about your piece of paper anymore. I don't care about your precedents. I don't care about your procedures, your legalistic rules of law and stuff like that. I care about defeating the bad guys.
Yeah.
I care about saving my country. It's the whole Napoleon quote. He who saves his country violates no law.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you were to find other examples of Caesar figures that emerge in history, Napoleon is probably the next best example of somebody who overthrows the system, stages a coup, deposes the republic, makes himself dictator, and then eventually makes himself emperor. Napoleon is a Caesar who does not get assassinated.
Yeah. And Napoleon was another person who arguably, even though he was Corsican, right, like believed in the glory of France.
Yes.
He believed that the Bourbons had been corrupt. He also believed that
the Republic was a disaster.
Well, the Directorate had become corrupt, and he was going to quote, save the republic, and then he replaced it with an empire. But it's not as if he didn't love France, right? He loved the idea of France, and he actually believed that there was a lot of reforms that came about through the revolution that were worthwhile. If you actually look at a lot of things that Napoleon did into areas that he conquered, he did a lot of things that were heavily populist.
He talked about when he took power, he basically said he didn't say I'm overthrowing the revolution. He said the revolution is complete.
Yeah.
When he took power. And one of his greatest accomplishments was not just his battlefield prowess, it was the Napoleonic Code. He tried to, I mean, a lot of what Napoleon did was actually spread the revolution. That's actually my biggest criticism of Napoleon, is that he spread the revolution in a lot of places. Not in the sense that he toppled all the kings, but in the sense that he spread a lot of principles that were espoused by the revolution. Some good, but some, I would argue, long-term actually bad. There was a quote actually from Napoleon right after he lost the Battle of Leipzig, which was kind of the beginning of the end. No, you could argue that Spain and Russia were, but you get the point.
Yeah.
He said that after me, the revolution will continue. It'll be like you've removed the dog tag from the book and you begin to read again at the page where you left off.
Yeah.
But to go back to Caesar, that is what, this looks like. We brought up Napoleon because that's just another example, basically. But it is people who decide, no, reform. We are far gone past that point. Like, we don't need a constitutional amendment. We need a coup d'etat.
Well, I think the psychological break is it's not just when people become disillusioned with the system not working the way they think it should. I think it really comes into, in fact, when you have a significant number of the population. And by significant, I don't mean majority. I mean a significant number of the people that you need to fight wars and start revolutions, which is usually a combination of a certain social elite combined with young men. But it's not that they believe that the system doesn't work. It's that they believe that the system is directly aligned against them.
Yes.
The system is my enemy.
And the system must be overthrown.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's when you no longer have any buy-in. So like when you think of Cincinnatus, and when you think of the Gracchi and Sulla, there's buy-in if you think about it. It's messy, it's chaotic. In many of these cases, the Gracchi are murdered. Sulla, persecutes his political enemies. Like, it is messy business.
Mm-hmm.
The first half of the crisis of the Roman Republic, right?
Yeah.
People are getting killed. There's coups, there's civil wars, there's intrigue, there's violence, all that stuff. But, for all of the faults of these people, you could still make the argument very strongly that there's buy-in in the system, in the sense that these are people, for all of their immense faults, they're trying to save the system.
Yeah.
We can nitpick, and there's plenty of stuff to nitpick about what they did, right? But there is this sense that I am trying to save the system. I'm trying to yes, I'm cracking a bunch of eggs or heads in many cases, but I am trying to save this system that's in crisis. A Caesar figure is, like you said, there's no buy-in anymore. I have come to the conclusion that the system is illegitimate and it's evil and it's directly aligned against me.
Yeah.
And so I have become a revolutionary, basically, where you're not trying to save the system, you are trying to overthrow the system at that point, because you think the system is hurting you, that it's evil, that it's aligned against you. And so it's not about, we need to reform the system. It is, we need to take power and overthrow the bad guys that are hurting us, that are directly aligned against us.
Let me draw an example to the American Revolution. When most people, I think when most people are unfamiliar with in their timeline, in their head, is that the shot heard around the world and whatnot, and the Continental Army and fighting at Bunker Hill, we were still seeking reconciliation with the crown. Like, I think most people think, shot heard around the world, we started the Revolutionary War. Not technically. The Second Continental Congress had met up. They had formed the Continental Army, and it was this idea that the other states were going to render aid to Massachusetts, but you still had the Olive Branch petition. What happened was the crown's response to the Olive Branch petition. So you had factions within the colonies. Massachusetts was one, which, like, they wanted independence. You also had people like, prominent people within Virginia that wanted independence. You also had states that were absolutely against it. New York, Pennsylvania, with the exception of Franklin. South Carolina. You had a lot of other states that this was not about independence. This was about a redress of grievances with the crown to restore their rights as natural born English citizens, because that's how they saw themselves. But when the crown's response to the olive branch petition was essentially, we're going to hunt you down and kill you as traitors unless you obediently come back and beg forgiveness of the crown, that's when all of a sudden the delegates from places like Pennsylvania, Dickinson, like New York, I think it was Rutledge in South Carolina, that's when all of a sudden it was like, okay, we can't, independence is now the course of action that we're going to have to take. But I think it's important to understand. The reason why I bring that up is because even though the founders had gotten to a point where many thought independence was inevitable, that was not the original argument. It was, we're going to appeal to the seat of power for a redress of our grievances. And when the seat of power treated them with contempt, that's what galvanized the push for independence. And even then, it's not as if everyone in the colonies was like, all right, let's go do this. There were loyalist regiments that were brought up from the colonies. There were a lot of other colonists that wanted nothing to do with it. There were a lot of other colonists that their industry and their businesses depended upon trade with England that wanted nothing to do with it. Right? You could argue that it was not a majority of the colonies that or the population within the colonies that wanted to actively fight a war, but that's not what was necessary. What was necessary was a certain elite which had credibility and enough people that were willing to pick up muskets.
We have two questions. One of them, I think you literally just answered, because Connor said, what was the tipping point in the Revolutionary War when it became one of independence?
Yeah.
When did the crown make it clear that they didn't respect them as British citizens? That, I think you literally just answered that.
George III's response to the Olive Branch petition is what I think kind of eroded the power of the non-independence faction within the Continental Congress.
Okay, so right before that, Whitfield asked, to connect to a more recent history, how do more recent popular faction leaders, for example, like Churchill, compare to the Roman leaders like Caesar?
I would say there's nothing in common. If you want to find a more recent example, it would be Francisco Franco.
Yeah, Franco. Well, okay, you could also point to, if you're just looking for populist leaders.
Well, I mean like populist leaders that are like, no, we're not reform. Like, for example, in the immediate lead up to the Spanish Civil War, the conservatives in Spain, there was a faction of conservatives that were like, we just need to organize, form a political party, get our people elected, and we can fix the problems. And they did that. They formed CETA.
Yeah.
And they won the second election that was held, and they were denied power.
Yeah.
They were stonewalled. And then there was another election held, and the left-wing communist Marxist Popular Front won, arguably based on fraud.
Yeah.
And they're like releasing criminals from prison, seizing people's property, like shooting nuns and stuff like that, burning church. It was just anarchy. People thought that there was already a Marxist revolution underplay. You should read some of the quotes. I have a book downstairs about the Spanish Civil War. Some of the quotes in there from the socialist leaders talking about how we're going to integrate Spain into the Soviet Union, and the People's Revolution is going to crush everything before it and carry nothing after it, and we're going to seize the means of production. The conservatives in Spain by 1936 were like, we are on the verge of being ruled by Stalin. And so they shifted from, the Republic just got off on a wrong foot. It was an accident. We just need to organize peacefully and get our people elected and reform the process within the system, to, we are begging the military to overthrow the system. And when they attempted to do that and failed, the coup did not succeed, right? They only took over a portion of the country.
Yeah.
Immediately, conservatives were like, no, we're behind you guys. Like, death to the Republic is what they were saying. And that is when you get a Caesar moment. It's like you said, there's no buy-in with the system anymore. It's just simply, I need to overthrow the system.
Yeah.
That's
So
when you
have
get
you
a Caesar
given
moment.
your verdict yet?
I already laid out what I think are the requirements, and I think you agree. I don't think there's disagreement between you and I.
No. Those are the conditions, and then you have a catalyst, and that's usually what.
So here's the couple points that I've got for why I think this is not just potential, but arguably likely, but maybe not imminent. The first one I have is that the U.S. is already kind of a late stage republic, in my opinion. When you think about all the different crises that we have, mass migration, elites that are waging basically total war on their own people. This goes back to the Christopher Lasch episode that we did. They're tourists in their own country. They have no loyalty to our country. when you think about all of the intense fracturing of the culture and public opinion and populism and just kind of the rise of two separate countries now. It's not that we don't agree on solutions to the problem. We don't agree on like basic facts, right? Like we don't even agree on whether or not something is a problem. We have Democrats, for example, right now in the state of Maryland who wouldn't even put out a press release when one of their own citizens gets murdered, mother of 5, gets murdered by an El Salvadorian illegal immigrant. This happened 2 years ago. They don't put out a press release about that, but they're talking about how they're going to fly to El Salvador and confront Bukele in person to demand that he re-import an illegal immigrant who might be a member of MS-13 back into Maryland.
Yeah.
We do not have the same moral framework right now.
That brings me to a question from Darth Amalgamation saying, do you think a Democrat winning the next presidential election would instigate a Caesar situation?
So hang on, to go through the rest of the points, this might answer the question.
Yeah.
So I think that we're kind of in this late stage republic where we have multiple examples of like signs of just total institutional collapse, a fracturing of public opinion, the emergence of a strong friend-enemy distinction. And it's no longer, for a long time, remember the whole quote that like, the left thinks the right is evil and the right thinks the left is stupid or misguided? The right thinks the left is evil too now.
Yeah.
And so you've had a declaration of enmity that has been given from the left to the right, and the right has finally gotten the message and they've reciprocated.
Yeah.
And so now the friend-enemy distinction is internalized. There's no Soviets to fight. As far as we know, the Chinese aren't invading Taiwan, at least right now.
Yeah.
So we're looking at ourselves internally, and one side has just, I mean, let's be honest, the last 10 years is enough evidence to me, and certainly the last 5 years, that the left has declared total ideological war on the right.
Yeah.
And the right has now looked at it and said, you people are not just misguided, you people are evil. You will be defeated. Your ideology is not going to take over this country.
Mm-hmm.
This is no longer, oh, I think you're misguided. No. You are bad people. And you should not be allowed to hold political power. When you get to that point, and the intensity has gotten to that level, I don't see how you get away back from that point. And so the next point is, okay, well, do you still have buy-in? The left has no buy-in. The left wants to overthrow this country, basically. And the right is now realizing that what is the point of all these documents when half the country does not care at all about them? We talk about, checks and balances, the rule of law. The rule of law is a myth. How can you have the rule of law if men write laws and men enforce laws? You can have the rule of law when men write and enforce laws, and we all believe in them, and we all agree with them, and we all have the same fundamental principles, moral worldview, philosophical starting point, and we can adjudicate them within those boundaries. But when you have a group of people that say, I reject your laws because it was written by evil straight white men, well, then why should I care about the rule of law when the other side has demonstrated time and time and time again that the rule of law is a myth? It doesn't matter. And so I would argue the Constitution died with COVID. The Constitution died 20 million illegal immigrants ago. It died with BLM riots. It died with lockdowns. When the left respects no restraint on power whatsoever, no limitations, no checks and balances, no rule of law, no precedent setting, what is the point of respecting those things anymore? You're only tying your own hands. And so the conclusion that I have is that a Caesar is inevitable and that the Republic's days are numbered, but he's not imminent.
Okay. So you think it's going to happen, but as far as when,
who knows? Sure. It's like Bismarck, right? I some damn foolish thing in the Balkans, but I can't tell you when.
Yeah. So here's what I'll go. I think there's a lot of truth in the idea that this is probably the first time in a long time in American history where we have had two different groups that are significantly different enough to want very, very different things, and they're not compatible. I think it's probably the first time in American history that we can say that those two groups have disagreed fundamentally about the nature of reality. And that's what I think makes it different than, say, like the Civil War, where obviously huge disagreements, but we all kind of knew what we were disagreeing about. Whereas right now, I think it's different. the one thing I'll push back on is I don't agree with the idea that the Constitution is dead. I don't agree that the rule of law, doesn't matter and nobody follows it. Because I think obviously there's been many times where the rule of law has. I think on a day-to-day basis, the rule of law functions fairly well more often than it doesn't. I think that on a daily basis, the Constitution does effectively function more often than it doesn't. I do agree with the idea that, again, I hate to say never before, but let's just say the left wing of the country, I don't think has a fundamental commitment to the Constitution. I think they have a practical commitment to it, to the extent that they find it beneficial for the concentration of power. And I think that is an underlying problem that is going to have to be dealt with. But this idea that it all just broke and it all just went away during COVID, I think that's demonstrably false in the sense that we're still having elections. We're still, our court system is still applying. People are still getting arrested for doing stuff. You're absolutely right that there were moments during like the riots in 2020, and there were moments where the state governments clearly cracked down on things that I think violated probably many of their state constitutions, with the exception that there were contingencies within each of those state constitutions that granted emergency powers to governors to deal with crisis situations. And you could argue that the very mechanism that we don't possess at the federal level does exist at the state level. And it was used in a way that I think most of us look at and say, yep, see, that's the problem, is just granting broad-based powers, emergency powers to a chief executive in the moment of a crisis. And so I think it goes back to the strength of some of the arguments that the founders made in our federal system, is we don't want to do that at the federal level, but there are some mechanisms where it should exist at the state level. And we saw a classic example of when it was used very, very poorly at the state level in places like California, but then arguably was used, far more wisely in places like Florida or South Dakota or other states that didn't engage in widespread lockdowns, but also would have never tolerated widespread riots. I think actually one of the brilliant components of our system is the federalist component here, where it's Donald Trump did not say, I'm going to use the military to go in and stop every single riot. I will provide resources as requested by governors, but I will respect our federalist process. And you know what we found out? Blue states with blue governors and blue mayors were all too happy to have their cities burned to the ground in order to punish Donald Trump. What a dumb thing to do. What an overwhelmingly ridiculous response. And now what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing a lot of the consequences within those blue states on what happens when you refuse to enforce crime, when you don't apply the Constitution, your state constitution, appropriately. What I don't want is for the right to now look at the federal government and say, this is what we need is more federal power to crack down. No, I'm sorry. If a blue state wants to run itself into the ground, then allow that blue state to deal with the consequences, and let it be a great reminder to every other state that this is what happens when you adopt these sorts of policies. I think in many respects, our federalist system is working the way it was intended to. Now, the growing concern has to be the fact that the left looks at the problems within their own states and says, the solution is more federal dollars, is more federal power. It's to quote Christian Hines, it's to liberate the trans kids of Mississippi. And so, yes, I think we always need to be careful about the left's attempt to try to concentrate more power in its hands in order to impose what it wants to see on other states. But I also still hold out a great deal of hope that the genius of the system that our founders put into place is that it didn't give the federal government the amount of power that other systems have, and that states have been able to push back, and that people within those states, many of them have actually seen the problems of what happens under that sort of progressive woke leadership and are now waking up to it. Not all of them, right? But the mayor of New York, I'm not saying he's completely reformed, but he's left the Democratic Party. That's something. It's not everything I would want, but it's something. I'm seeing more and more people leave places like California, not because they just want to get a better tax break, but because they genuinely want to live in a state that doesn't punish them for not only being productive, but for not wanting to trans their kids. And so I have not given up on our constitutional system. I think we do need to put more emphasis on the sort of changes that need to take place at the state level. I do want to see the federal government under Trump, under Doge, significantly reduce federal power, even though I acknowledge that, look, I started off very optimistic. I'm still optimistic, but we're about to release another episode on Doge Watch where we're addressing some of the comments that were made by Elon Musk at a cabinet meeting. So I get it. I don't discount the concerns that you've brought up. I just don't think we're far along. I don't think we're so far down the path that it's inevitable. And I do think that in some respects, not in all, in some respects, we are seeing the benefits of our system, because if there's one thing that differentiates our system from the Roman Republic, it really is that federalist concept. And I do believe it provides us a mechanism. Right now, I think we're trying to see the sort of significant changes that we need to see at the federal level, but I don't count out the bureaucracy's ability to insulate and defend itself from reform. I am starting to see major pushbacks within our educational system, within Hollywood, within music, within journalism. And I'm seeing like this rise of new media, which is now being followed with rise of new entertainment, which is being which is also being followed by this significant increase. One of the biggest responses to COVID was, I'm not trusting the government to educate my kids anymore. It's nowhere near at the percentage that I would like to see, but nobody can question that it's increased exponentially, and I think it will have an impact. Because one of the things that we saw within our own revolution, and pretty much every revolution, is you don't need everybody to be on board with it, but you do need enough people that have properly diagnosed the problem and have actually come forward with a decent remedy. And so I'm not willing to give up on it just yet, and I don't say that I don't say that out of a conviction or hyper patriotism, where no matter what's going down, I'm going down with the ship no matter what. I'm saying that I'm starting to see these corrections take place, and I do think, I will say this point, Christian, and on this point, you and I are in complete agreement. We are at a decisive point in American history. I do think that if we do not see significant reductions in the overall federal bureaucracy and federal power and the ability of the federal government to do what has now been exposed, where the left gets to confiscate your tax dollars to indoctrinate your children, right? If we don't see significant changes with respect to that, if we don't see significant changes with respect to our monetary system, well, then there are certain things that are inevitable. I don't know if it's the full downfall of the republic, but it's certainly going to be a change from the system as we currently know it, and most of us have grown up in it. That part I do think is inevitable. But I still hold out hope that our constitutional system, our federal system, possesses the ability to allow for those corrections. And I do think people are starting to properly diagnose the problem and come up with solutions that will actually be meaningful. And one of the things that I am the most grateful for is that it's not so dependent upon political power, right? It's about understanding that who wields political power is largely determined by how you raise your children. People that say, well, we need better politicians. You want better politicians? Get a better electorate. You want a better electorate? Stop relying on the institutions which are actively working against you to be the ones that have the predominant ideological impact on your children's lives. And the more I see people responding to that in appropriate ways, the more hope I have that we are actually going to weather the storm. But to your point, it is not going to come without pain. And how people start to respond to the pain, it is going to be ultimately the question on who they seek out as the person that leads them through that.
Whitfield's asking if instead of switching the top of the power, Caesar situation, if Convention of States could be a mode of.
Yeah, Connor, Whitfield was having difficulties formulating the question. Connor has formulated it as, is there a chance in the future that instead of a Caesar, we'll experience a reform by a Convention of States, ignoring the restructuring of the current federal system? My answer, and I'm curious what you have to say on this, my answer is it won't matter at all, because the left doesn't respect the Constitution as it's currently written. Why would they respect it if we change some words on a piece of paper?
Here's where I'll disagree on that. The reason why, when you say the left doesn't care about the Constitution, I disagree. I think the left wants to fundamentally alter the Constitution in ways that bear no resemblance to the American Republic, but they still respect it because they understand that it has cultural relevance and it has legal relevance. It's not like the left is going out there right now and just seizing the means of production. Why? Because the cops will show up and arrest him, and they'll go to court, and they'll be tried and convicted and put in jail. Right? They're not seizing, the Senate right now. Why? Because cops will show up and arrest him and put him in jail. And guess what? Most people will cheer if they do it that way.
That's actually why I don't think either side has tried to strike first.
Well, yes,
we're in this holding pattern almost, this twilight of democracy,
but I don't
it's
know
a Cold War.
I don't know that it is the twilight, right? That is one of that's the whole argument we're having right now, is that I don't think it is necessarily inevitable. I think there is room for correction within our system, but the question will be is proper diagnosis of the problem. And that remains to be seen. When it comes to Convention of States, I think what you need to understand is that the only way Convention of States or an Article 5 convention works is that if you actually have enough states on board. And we don't have enough states on board right now to do that. And so it sounds like a nice idea. I agree that it is a constitutionally acceptable process for reform, but without a sufficient number of states to actually want that and do it,
And there's also no guarantee that they will stick to the reforms you've sent them to stick to. There is also a possibility of what you would call a runaway convention, which is not unheard of. It's part of how it's part of our history. In fact,
if you don't go into a convention of states with arguably. Here would be the only conditions in which you could actually get something out of conventions of state that would actually work. You need to go in there with probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 states, absolutely dedicated to a very, very specific purpose. And each one of those state legislatures that is, quote, on your side. I don't mean red states. I mean 35 states comprised of legislatures that absolutely want the sort of very specific reforms you're talking about, that will then appoint the delegates to that convention that will actually seek out those things. So when you look at it in concept,
we can't even get certain things supported by every single member of all the Republicans in even our own state legislature can't get on board with some very basic things that would be extremely popular. You can't even get them on board. What makes you think you're going to get a much wider swath of people on board to elect the proper delegates to this said convention?
Yeah.
I think
I don't think it's
there's a lot more danger there than there is. It doesn't make me feel very comfortable. The fact that we're so gridlocked within our own party to do things that would be incredibly popular amongst the electorate, we can't even get solid conservatives to do that. What makes us think we could do it on a grander scale?
Let me go in and say this too. I will push back on the idea that Article 5 or Convention of States, and there's some differences there, right? That, oh my gosh, we're going to have a convention, it's going to be a runaway, and we're going to lose the Second Amendment. Okay, the same mechanisms that make it hard to do the things you want with the Convention of States make it hard to do bad things with the Convention of States as well. So I don't like what I would consider to be hyperbolic arguments on either side of this case. I think what people need to understand, though, is that culturally and from a state perspective, we are not at a point where Convention of States will achieve what you want. And so therefore you have to be more concerned about it achieving what you don't want.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I care too much about my Second Amendment rights to go and tweak some things that might need tweaking right now. There are too many things that I want to keep. I want to keep those there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the broader issue that I'm just going to keep going back to is all of these things only work with a society that agrees that they will work.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitution does not defend itself. The rule of law does not defend itself. Process and procedure and mechanism and Robert's Rules of Order, these things are not divinely ordained. They're man-made processes that only work and function when people collectively agree we are all going to obey by these rules.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody explain to me how you get people who are at war with biology to come on board with accepting these things as norms that need to be respected.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got people right now who will not accept the Gulf of America because it's been the Gulf of Mexico for 400 years. Yet they're perfectly happy altering what has been known to be a fact for all of human history, and that is male and female biology.
Yeah.
They're happy to throw all of that history away. So it just literally is just whatever suits them. And you can't even argue with these people anymore, which
that goes back to my point. Like, what good is a convention? Great. Convention of States, if it comes out and you have all these great amendments that, fix all these problems that we as conservatives identified, that'd be great, except for the fact that half of our country are certifiably insane and are captured by an ideology.
Once again, I'm going to push back. There are two things that make a law enforceable, right? The first one is collective agreement on the just nature of the law, right? So that's self-regulation. But that's not the only mechanism. We have a ton of people that are not too keen to obey our laws on murder, and they murder people. And we don't go to them and be like, we'd really like to convince you that murder is bad. No, we send people with guns to their door and we arrest them and we put them in jail. So no, what it is it's a combination of a significant portion of the population agrees that the law is just and the processes and mechanisms are just. And then those who don't are then required to comply through the threat of or application of force. And so the reason why, again, I'm not advocating for a convention of states. Can we just establish that?
Yeah, no, I get that.
What I am saying is that to suggest that there would be no value if you did have, let's say, an ideal convention of states outcome, to suggest that it would have no value because some people wouldn't comply with it, I think that part is incorrect. It would be a question of how many people do comply with it, and then are they willing to use the force at the legal force at their disposal in order to enforce compliance somewhere else? Which is to say that, let's say, we reiterated within the Second Amendment that no, shall not infringe means shall not infringe, and New York goes, well, we want to infringe anyways. Like, well, now you can't. There's a legal mechanism to say that you're not permitted to do so, right? So that's all I'm saying is to say that's because some people don't obey the law that therefore the law doesn't matter. It's, well, no, you need a critical mass of people to obey the law, and then you need a mechanism to enforce it on those who refuse to comply. And
I think that's ultimately why I think we're going to get a Caesar, because who's going to be doing the enforcing?
Yeah.
Like this is why in America, I think America doesn't fully realize it, but I think America wants a Caesar and that she's going to get one, because you have so many signs of institutional collapse, of a polarizing public, the growth of populism, the emergence of an intense ideological divide that's it's no longer, oh, I disagree with you on tax policy, but it is, no, you are fundamentally an immoral person who's pushing for things that are going to result in the destruction of civilization.
Yeah.
And this is shared across both boundaries. The left has for the longest time thought that the right is evil, and the right is now responding in kind. They realize that the left as an ideology is evil and must be defeated, not debated, not voted out of office, defeated. The left, any system that permits leftism to exist is not a system that is worth defending. And that is the direction that I think that we're inevitably going to go over a long enough period of time, is that people are just going to be tired of dealing with this. Why are we having to debate people who think that child mutilation should be normal? I'm not interested in having a debate with you. I'm interested in defeating those type of people and defeating that ideology.
Yeah.
And eventually you're going to run out of procedural mechanisms to adjudicate that difference. And people are going to say, I'm going to just throw my hands up in the air and be like, somebody needs to solve this problem. And that somebody is going to be a Caesar.
And that's when you hit the critical mass for that. Right?
I have one final quote that I think drives my point home, because as shocking as it might seem, the founding fathers, no, it's not Franco.
Okay.
It's not Franco.
No, Franklin.
Oh, yeah, it is Franklin. Nick guessed it. I was like, no, it's not Franco. It's going to be one of our founding fathers. There is a quote from the Constitutional Convention that was uttered on June 4th, 1787 by Benjamin Franklin. And he says, "The first man put at the helm will be a good one. Nobody knows what sort may come afterwards. The executive will always be increasing here, as elsewhere, till it ends in a monarchy." Our founding fathers knew that the system that they were constructing was not a permanent system that would last until the end of time. They believed in polybius cycles. And maybe that should be a whole podcast at some point in the future where we talk about
the cycle
of governments.
We should definitely do Polybius cycles. Okay, so here's my response as we close up now. again, I think I'm not arguing. It is always easy to bet on eventual despotism, because if you look at the whole course of human history, of which the American Republic is a relatively short period, right? We're coming up on 250 years, and so this idea that we can conclusively say that we will exist until the second coming, it is probably an ambitious claim, but certainly one that I think is actually worth striving for. I understand the pull and the drive toward wanting problems fixed, and inevitably coming to the conclusion that the systems that you have in play, the processes that you have established, become so weighed down through bureaucracy and corruption that essentially it takes a significant shaking up of the system in order to restore it, or it gets changed to something else, which is more often the case in many respects, where you end up with more centralized power. I think we've discussed today where we both agree that we're probably not going to get a Cincinnatus. We both agree that a Sulla is potentially possible, but what it is, does it actually restore, or does it eventually break and set the seeds for eventual destruction? I think you're at the conclusion that eventually we get a Caesar. It's just inevitable. That's the course of human history, and it's not even necessarily something that you want in the form that people think of Caesar, but just doing an honest analysis, that's what it is. I would propose, and I've suggested this before, and I think there's something to it. One, I think that when you do find something that you truly believe in, it's worth fighting for. And I'm not trying to be overly romantic. I just think that ultimately the societies that survive are the ones that people believe in and are willing to fight for. And so I'm not black-pilled about American society or about our constitutional republic. The other thing I will say is that I believe that our Cincinnatus might come in the form of our system, and that's federalism. And I don't know that it will be one particular person that has to stand up. I certainly have, I certainly have hopes for what the Trump administration can accomplish. And it's not just Trump, right? It's the administration. But that is going to require other people within Congress, within the courts, to be able to, be partners with that. And so we'll see what happens. But ultimately, I do believe that our federalist system is something that is special, that is unique, that was set up as a contingency for what would happen if we did see the sort of usurpation of federal power. And I still hold out hope that our Cincinnatus will come not only point of a system, federalism, but also individual leaders that will step up within those respective states that have the potential to push back should it ever get to that point. But the thing that I would like people to understand is that the moment you are sitting around waiting for someone to solve this problem for you is the moment that inevitably you will need someone to do that. And they might solve it in a way that you never anticipated, never wanted, or never thought was sufficient. I think one of the things that our founders tried to establish is that, and Lincoln actually talked about this, that as a nation of free people, we should either endure forever or die by suicide. And to Christian's point, most nations throughout society have eventually died by suicide. Some through foreign conquest, but the ones that were truly powerful essentially ate themselves up through their own contradictions or decadence before they were ever taken over by somebody else. And the United States is uniquely positioned geographically to be in a place where we're actually quite secure. And so the proposition of suicide of the Republic is, I think, far more prominent than any sort of foreign threat or invasion. But ultimately, we can change a lot of that in one generation. There is nothing that says that you have to raise your children in a way that is going to subject them to the sort of ideology that I think all of us at this table agree has put our republic in peril. There's nothing that says you have to constantly expose your children to ideas which are detrimental and decadent. There's nothing that says you have to make any of those decisions. You have far more power over how you raise the next generation than what you do with the current one. And so the thing I would ask people to consider is that perhaps Cincinnatus will come in the form of us no longer accepting certain status quos with respect to those culturally shaping institutions. Maybe it will happen when more of us decide that we're going to take control over the things that we can control and subsequently make far better decisions that we will see manifested in future generations. And Nothing about that is to say that we have to stop fighting for the institutions as they currently exist, or to fight for our political institutions, or to try to elect better leaders. But again, I'll go back to the way I started this off. If what we're now waiting for is Caesar, okay, you can get Caesar. You just can't choose what sort of Caesar you get ultimately. Usually when that sort of power gets vested in an individual, they do not wield it in the ways that you would anticipate or that you would ultimately want, even if they are trying to address certain problems that you've both acknowledged are problems. And so I would hope that we can continue to fight for the Republic while properly diagnosing the problems that got us here, and hopefully educating a future generation to properly diagnose them, and then recognize that ultimately, in order for the processes that have been put in place in this country to be successful, we need to remember what Adam said, is that our Constitution was ultimately made for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to the government of any other. And if we can't raise a generation to actually believe in self-regulation, to believe in objective truth, to believe in objective morality, and to be willing to fight for it and defend it and pass it on to future generations, well, then Caesar is what we deserve. But I hope that is not us. All right. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you found this an intriguing and interesting conversation. Please leave us some comments on what you think. Is it going to be Sulla? Is it going to be Cincinnatus? Is it going to be Caesar? Is it going to be something else? And we're also debating right now on whether or not we just elect Christian as ultimate dictator of the world.
No, this is my Cincinnatus moment.
Yeah.
I am basically a monarchist. I would probably prefer to have a king at this point. I would not be the man for the job.
Well, I'm still Team Republic. Christian is now team reactionary, team potential monarchist. We'll next time Tina's gonna have to tell us what team she's on. Once again, thank you all very much for joining us, and we will see you next episode.